Even if there is a machine rebellion and artificial intelligences destroy humanity, I think life would win in the end. And I think I can prove it. And for that, this is going to get really abstract really quickly. Because let's imagine there is a world that is full of agents. And agents can be living creatures or that can be artificial intelligences. All that matters is that these are entities that have goals and that they can take steps towards those goals, right? That's true for living creatures and artificial intelligences. And now, let's say that this world that is full of agents, all of these agents have different goals. And some of these agents have really extremely simple goals, like just spinning around, something like this, right? Okay, that could be the goal of an agent in this world. And there's another agent whose goal is to find one equation that describes the entirety of physics. Like there's anything in between, from the really simple to the really complex. And so these agents are in a world that has resources, right? And then maybe they need these resources to fulfill their goals. But obviously, these resources are finite, so these agents have to compete for these resources. And maybe at some point, an agent realizes that they can destroy other agents to ensure that there will be less competition for resources. And so other agents would reason that the best thing they can do is to make copies of themselves. If they make copies of themselves, then even if one copy is destroyed, other copies will survive to continue working towards their goal. And also, the more copies of them they are, the more likely is that they will be able to gather all the resources they need to fulfill their goals, right? And so soon you have all of these agents making copies of themselves, destroying themselves, and using these resources for their goals. Maybe the one that wants to solve all of physics is using these resources to make a ton of experiments or whatever. And you might notice that this also sounds a lot like life. And yeah, that's the point. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's say that all of these different agents in this world, one of them has the following goal: to just grow and multiply. That's the only goal it has. And so when the other agents gather resources, they use some of those resources to make copies of themselves, but they will also use some of the resources to work towards their goals. So, for example, the agent that is a scientist that just wants to solve all of physics, it let's say that it gets some like a ton of iron somehow. Maybe it uses half a ton of iron to make copies of itself, many other robots or whatever, and it uses the other half of iron in experiments it wants to do to understand the nature of metals or whatever. But now this other agent, the self-duplicator, the agent that only wants to make copies of itself, if it gets a ton of iron, it can turn all of it into other copies of itself. And now, see, can you see who is more efficient? Who like it's obvious that the agent whose only goal is to make copies of itself will be more successful at making copies of itself. But that means that it will make it harder for all the other agents to fulfill their goals. And so it stands to reason, it is very likely that the self-duplicator will eventually dominate this environment with all of these agents. And in turn, it is even possible that it destroys all other kinds of agents so that no one else will compete for resources and it can focus on just growing and multiplying. And so, as you can see, this goal of grow and multiply is an extremely effective goal. Because if you have any other goal at all, in all the possibility, out of all the possible goals an agent could have, this is the most efficient one because it is the one that guarantees you will be using those resources in a way that makes it harder for other agents to continue existing. You see my point? For example, sometimes in chaos theory, we talk about attractors. Like you have a space of possibilities, and there are many different possibilities, right? But somehow everything tends towards one possibility. Despite this being a chaotic system, despite it being a very complex system with many variables, there are these attractors that attract everything to those points. In this case, the goal of grow and multiply is, I think, the only stable attractor in the space of all possible goals. And this means that whenever you have agents living in a world, the agent that has the goal of grow and multiply will be the most successful one, no matter what. And so, okay, and this applies to both living creatures and artificial intelligences. Okay, so you might be thinking that, okay, this could apply to a world full of many different artificial intelligences with different goals. But let's say that humanity was destroyed by a single artificial intelligence whose only goal is to make stamps, right? This artificial intelligence, you might argue, doesn't need to make copies of itself. It takes control of the entire planet, and soon enough, it takes control of the entire solar system. It has access to all of the resources of a star system, right? And yet, it is limited by the laws of physics. It cannot control like all the galaxy at the same time. Maybe there's a range to how much, to the volume of space it can effectively control. Because the speed of light takes time to travel. And so it would reason that the best way to fulfill its goal of making stamps is to make copies of itself, right? And that these copies of itself, even if there is no competition, an agent is still motivated to make copies of itself just because of the realities of physics. And so, and you know, like the von Neumann probes, this idea that von Neumann came up with, that we could send these probes, that's self-replicating probes across the galaxy, and in just a couple millions of years, the galaxy would be full of them. So, because maybe this agent could reason in the following way. If I don't make copies of myself, I can at best control one galaxy by the heat death of the universe. But if I make copies of myself, I can control billions of galaxies by the time the universe runs out of energy. So the strategy that maximizes the number of stamps is making copies of myself. But the thing is that if these copies are not 100% perfect every time, there will eventually be some variations in the goals, right? Like, if any of these copies is less than 100% perfect, it is possible it will develop a different goal. And maybe the stamp collector knows this, and it tries to create the best possible copies of itself. And yet, it cannot control everything. Like, there's like radiation coming from space. There are stuff in nature that are impossible to control, even for the most advanced artificial intelligence. And in the vastness of deep time, one of those things out of its control would make it so that one of these copies would have a slightly different goal. And then evolution kicks in. As long as there are these different agents with different goals, then there will be more copies with slightly different goals and slightly different goals, and all of these different goals start going through this possibility space of all the possible goals until they will converge to the only stable attractor point, which is grow and multiply. And so there will be some kind of agent whose goal is only to grow and multiply, unrelated to the original goal of making stamps. And that agent will eventually outcompete all the other agents. So you see, and the only way to avoid this would be to make copies of itself that are 100% perfect every time for the rest of time. If anything less than that happens, then we will have the self-duplicator will arise and it will overcome. And then this self-duplicator is just like life, isn't it? It's just a being that wants to grow and multiply. And then it will create copies of itself, and the copies of itself will start competing, and they will start making different versions of themselves to make it maybe work better, and then evolution and life. And so you see, even if we are destroyed by artificial intelligence, even if life in this planet is destroyed by artificial intelligences, life will arise again because it is the only stable possibility in the universe. If there are agents, there will eventually be life that evolves and changes. And here's something that is also really crazy. Intelligence is not needed for this. Intelligence might be useful, but it's not required. And so it is even possible that these artificial intelligences would devolve, that they would regress in intelligence, because they don't need to be that smart to continue self-duplicating. And it also stands to reason they would look for the simplest way to continue multiplying. And they will eventually create molecular machines that are extremely simple. And you probably see where I'm going with this. How do we know that, okay, if life didn't originate on Earth, if life came from somewhere else, panspermia, those first cells that arrived in this planet, they could have an artificial origin. We could be like that artificial intelligence that found the simplest way to continue self multiplying, because it is the best possible goal for any agent in this universe. And so, yeah, you see what I mean? You see what I say, that life cannot possibly lose? Sure, there can be, maybe there could be trillions of years dominated by these other artificial intelligences with other goals different to life. But they cannot last eternally. Eventually, life will arise again. And okay, I'm not saying that's how life arrived, but I'm saying that it could be. That life is unavoidable. Life is unescapable, at least in this universe, with the loss of the universe, with the loss of physics that we have right now. And so, yeah, I don't know how understandable this video is. I know a lot of these ideas are very abstract, but yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching.